I'm Miranda Hickman, and I'm this year's director of the Poetry Matters project for McGill University's Department of English. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome two poets this afternoon based in different parts of Canada. Sarah Wolfson from Montreal in Quebec and Phillip Crymble from Fredericton in New Brunswick. And featured on our poster for this event are cover images from books by Phillip and Sarah. Sarah's is A Common Name for Everything, and Phillip's is Not Even Laughter, which appeared in 2015. And we'll have links to these books in the course of the session today. So since we're nearing the end of the year's work, I want to give just a brief sketch of what the group has addressed through different events this year. Among other things, we've been considering the question of how to create an aesthetics of hope, thinking about how poetry gives us language to articulate what we're feeling and thinking during these strange times. And we've been thinking about how poetry can provide a sense of solace, of contemplative time as we all feel destabilizing changes. We've also been thinking about how poetry can connect us. To pick up on the idea of common name from Sarah, poetry can remind us of those common names for everything and take us back to the vocabulary we share for the world and to the ordinary experiences that we have in common. We've also been considering how poetry can help us think, help toward new modes of thought, new ways of paying attention and engaging the worlds around us and within us. And this is what connects to Sarah's and Phillip's theme. Making strange suggests that poetry, through its power of making and naming, its music of language, has the ability to make the ordinary world feel strange. Defamiliarize everyday objects and experiences that we think we know, and frame these and express these so as to make them seem unfamiliar so that we can wake up to them newly. Reading Phillip's and Sarah's work and smelling the apples or the garlic, or seeing the leafcutter ants or the red-winged blackbirds in Sarah's poetry, or seeing in the mind's eye the specificity of cultural objects in Phillip's poetry, that particular car, that oil-burning Volkswagen Beetle, that issue of Marvel Comics, or those mugs of Builder's tea. I think about the way that poetry, fortunately, can take us away from familiar ways of saying and familiar ways of perceiving, allowing us to remove the film of familiarity that Coleridge talks of from our perceptions. So as Sarah and Phillip bring forward, this is one thing that poetry can give in these times, through images, through details, through particular words, the ability to pay attention newly and differently to what's around us and within us. What their title makes me think is that the making of poetry allows us to answer a deeply strange time with another kind of strangeness, a kind of affirmative strangeness that we arrive at through new acquaintance with the things of this world. As one of Sarah's poems has it, perhaps we can weigh one strangeness against another. So let me then turn to the poets. Phillip Crymble is a physically disabled writer and scholar living in Fredericton, New Brunswick. He is a poetry editor at the Fiddlehead. His poetry has appeared in, among other places, the Literary Review of Canada, the Forward Book of Poetry, the Malahat Review, the Montreal Prize Anthology, and Poetry Ireland Review. Not Even Laughter, his first full-length collection, was finalist for both the J.M. Abraham Prize and the New Brunswick Book Award. And in 2016, he was awarded the Puritan Magazine's annual Thomas Morton Poetry Prize. In 2017, he was voted the Reader's Choice Award winner in Arc Poetry's Poem of the Year contest. Of Not Even Laughter, Lorraine York notes, Crymble is a deftly formal poet. His interest in metrics and traditional forms flies subtly under the radar, informing and shaping his work at what feels like a molecular level. The judges for J.M. Abraham's Prize note how Crymble's dexterous lines, unfolding in assured rhythms and steeped in ideas, reveal new meanings in the everyday. Sarah is author of A Common Name for Everything, which was awarded the A.M. Klein Prize for Poetry from the Quebec Writers Federation. Her poems have appeared in Canadian and American journals, including The Walrus, The Fiddlehead, Tri-Quarterly, Michigan Quarterly Review, and Prism International. Her work has twice been nominated for a Pushcart Prize and has received notable mention in Best Canadian Poetry. Originally from Vermont, she now resides in Montreal. Bianca Vignas notes of A Common Name for Everything. In her debut, poet Sarah Wolfson becomes both pastoral cryptographer and medium to the wonderfully odd. Laura Dennis notes, above all, Wolfson's poems are concerned with the act of naming. They seek the exact words to get at the specificity of things. Sarah Wolfson herself notes on naming, what interests me is how we often experience the world before we have names for its matter, but also how we sometimes experience the world through its names. Sphagnum, mollusk, even though these things don't exist in front of me in daily life, the songs of their names do. Naming is something we try to get exactly right, but ultimately the thing and its name may inform each other in completely surprising ways, or not at all. So while naming is important, it's always full of the potential for astonishment. So with that, let me turn things along to Philip and Sarah. Each poet will read for about 15 minutes, after which time they will exchange with each other for a few minutes, asking each other questions. So without further ado, let me turn things over to you, Sarah and Philip. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us. And to everyone for coming. It's really quite moving to see people from many different walks of my life here. Thanks to Miranda for inviting us. I've enjoyed watching this initiative take shape, and I'm delighted to be here as a reader today. I'd like to position myself in this conversation as a practicing poet and teacher of writing. And as such, one of the things I always like to tell my students when they approach poetry writing, which is something they tend to view as something that's quite scary, is that each poem is a chance to reinvent the world. And I don't mean this in a grandiose sense. I just mean that each poem, with its particular lens or conceit, or its unique soundscape, or its use of image, has the potential to reframe the way the poet, and ideally also the reader, sees the world. And for me as a writer, these new ways of seeing often begin in a moment of strangeness and or estrangement. So what inspiration really feels like for me is a sudden strangening that begins in the moment of noticing, a sudden sense that I am not in the world as I was before, and it's now my job to communicate that strangening or estranging experience to a reader. In that vein, I've put together quite an eclectic set of poems to read that I hope shows the various ways in which I use estranging force in my work. I'll start with poems which I see as strangening largely through lens or conceit, and move to poems that offer soundscape as a way of strangening, and wind up with a couple of poems that are more traditionally narrative and image oriented. I want to say, though, as a disclaimer, especially if I have students here, that all of those things should ideally be interacting in any good poem, but it's just that I'm foregrounding the ones where certain elements are dominant here. One of the many things that's changed for me since the pandemic began is that I no longer commute by metro. I also no longer commute by bike, but I no longer commute by metro, which was a wonderful source of inspiration for me. I would often take a book and stand on the metro with it, but I couldn't read it because I so enjoy just looking around at the people and the space. I find it a really rich source of ideas. And this first poem that I'm going to read was inspired by watching people move up those enormously long escalators on the metro, and then imagining that what lay at the top was entirely different than our reality. So this first poem is called "This Is How I Imagine the Rapture." On the metro escalator, and you just keep going up, but at the top, there's a starburst, a cloud of smoke, and an all-knowing jellyfish god who tucks folks one by human-scented one into a tentacled cape. For example, him, that guy. If there's a good way to haul a double bass, he hasn't found it yet. But in the hereafter, he'll be glad he was lugging such a thing as that. And now the mime may have eternity to perfect the moment when he jerks up his invisible sparkling fish. such are the cosmic perks for those who deigned this day to take with others of their species a train. Those running, powering up the metal teeth in suits, at whom we've always sort of laughed a little, they go faster than the rest. And the young, attached and plumbing the contours of each other's uvulas, they go too, doing just that, before love gets crowded with its own fetid fruits. The late night stragglers are raptured last, leaving behind their final silver words on Earth's longest revolving handrail. The next poem I'm going to read also involves being in transit, both in a physical and maybe also a spiritual sense. This time the setting is a passenger train, and you just have to imagine that you're in one of those 6-person compartments traveling through a landscape, and you happen to get stuck there forever. It's a little bit like the isolation experiences we've been going through this past year, except in this poem, you're with strangers. This poem is called Night Travel. First lose the light, then the train, and as the great boxed-in shadow of yourselves takes out whole cornfields, wordlessly agree to right-crossed journey legs. Corn, what's it to you now your shadow snaps in half the floodlit steeples? Unvisitable towns wave their plastic welcome mat at your backs. Arrival is the new horizon. Near the door, to what? The young stuff their ears and mouths. When the little trolley rolls up with drinks, you think, tea, what is it? Still here in 7 settings of the sun? That's when you'll end diversion. Use words to decide who mates with whom and who gets the last moth-eaten rind. Then it's time to pool your languages. Choose one for housekeeping, one for games, one to describe the slightest changes in weather. The next poem I'll read, I think, begins to rely more on a sense of sound to strange in, but it also involves a central conceit, which is that a field of sheep has the stance of academic study imposed upon it. And I think that's all you need to know, except for the fact that the title runs right into the first line. A study, sought to fuse what we know about use with what we know about music, observing a herd of female ruminants foddered the tunes of Wagner, to which they made ecstatic milk, whose swells and lows were enough to make a lamb choke. After some turbulent early hours, however, the lambs thrived, though little is known about how allegro affects the ruminant stomach in the long term. Of note, no ewes supernovaed, no soil rose up and assumed mammal form, no moons met earth and two-stepped, just sheep and song. And when the song ended, just grass and bats and the loneliness of dreams, even the realized kind. So I'll move into a couple of poems that I think do more with this idea of soundscape as a strangening mode. This poem continues in the same stance of looking clinically, but here it looks at the human animal, as I like to think of it. My favorite human smile. For the wolf also pulls back lips against the flesh, and the partridge in her ruffled dotage sits content. But my favorite human smile hoists the mouth of one who has just run for and caught the bus. Specimen, private glee bent publicly, trumpeting minute daring do, that in so doing casts bright relief for the body unmangled by a moment's folly. A glow most notable for how fast it fades. How solemn now the face, as the gray plastic sack settles in the feet's not good enough, never good enough nest. So I actually teach writing at the McGill Writing Center. I teach both academic and creative writing. And one of the things we talk about in writing pedagogy is how to help students become aware of entering into a discourse community or entering into a particular way of talking and writing. And of course, you know, they need to enter into the discourse community that's appropriate for their academic field, but they also need to be able to read and move in other discourse communities. One of the things that I love about poetry is that you can borrow from discourse communities. And so the one thing the next poem does is it borrows the actual language of an academic study to sort of intensify the language of the poem. And this particular poem I guess I would say it uses sort of my own experiments with language and the study and the academic language from a study on choral reproduction to talk about, I guess, the pangs of being part of a parent generation. I don't think there's a really better way to describe it than that. I think you just have to listen to the poem. But again, it's concerned with language and sound as an intensifying and strangening force. The poem is called Regeneration, a Cornel, Choralic, Human. With human spawn, apples fall in certain proximity to the tree. Let that be a toast to thee, the tree. Or our sheep of another type, while acorns born, fall and are born again by circumstances beyond gravity, e.g. mandibularity of small mammals or fatted toddler claw. And coral by another grace remakes itself, not birth, nor fall, nor fume, nor maw. Sumich, 1996, suggests new coral bits bud off from parent polyps to expand or begin new colonies when the parent reaches a certain size and divides. So newness without novelty or breakage. But oh, how humans love that old roots and wings cliche. It's hard to get rid of, like a stray, like a child you have raised in the wrongish sorts of ways. So I'll read two final poems. These I would say are a bit more narrative and use image as their primary form of estrangement. These last two poems also happen to be about my neighbors, whom I've had lots of opportunities to observe during the pandemic, but I would also say that I hope all writers are observing their neighbors at all times, just as a source of material. So the first one is called Overwintered. I think it's a good one for actually this time of winter. At least in Montreal, we're having a real first melt, maybe the final melt. Overwintered. Just outside the border garden, one wayward crocus emerges first, though each year we hatch an old fear that this time it'll be gone, like the neighbor's husband, or the old man across the fence who wrote in his diary, tried to fix the lawnmower, then lay down forever. There's wonder in the way his wife tells it, in her mild avian hand. Turns out the perambulating cat is not pregnant, just fat. That's clear now the snow doesn't lap her white and low-hanging belly. Time also to take stock of friends' bellies, of the new border gardens of their eyes. So much snow in his beard. She must know for certain now she can't have that second baby. On our side, plaster cracks and crow's feet. It wasn't long after the new room was built that spiders appeared, pale taupe creatures that live and die in corners and make no formal thing of courtship. And the final poem I'll read today is called The Neighbors, and again, the title runs into the first line, so I'm about to repeat the title. The neighbors leave up their creche the entire winter, so it blows wildly in the January wind. The white metal-cut angel lit and strung from a single cord above the porch railing, her body tumbling, tossed, addled, contorted like the unfortunate Salem girls, and heralding, always heralding something crazily on her trumpet, something we cannot hear, whereas the family below, better anchored, doesn't have much to do but keep their eyes on their baby, can't even turn their heads to receive the warm breath of the sheep, observe the odd angle of the camel. Thanks everyone for listening. I'll turn the floor or box rather over to Philip.
All right, well, thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this reading series, and thank you, Miranda. It's just a pleasure to be here today. Just an opportunity to actually read work in front of people. It feels so impossible, and yet here it is happening. Okay, so, I have 6 poems to read today, and some just sort of brief remarks probably for most of them. This first one I'm going to read is called Trees and Weeds. And it's about, returning home after a holiday. You expect to come home and feel sort of relieved, and you are. But there's a kind of strangeness that accompanies that as well. Perhaps because the house has been empty for all of that time. There's just something odd and kind of disquieting about it. And that's what I really tried to capture in this book. So, as I said, it's called Trees and Weeds. How we long for known surroundings, nostalgia's equal mix of home and pain. Our first day back, we waken early, drink our coffee black. Worn down from 4 weeks holiday abroad, we stare dumbfounded at the table. The shattered sprays of blossom on the lilac tree release their sun-warm fragrance, draw us out of doors. Cheeks still creased with sleep, we wander barefoot in the garden, shade our eyes. The flower beds, a sanctuary for grasses, trees, and weeds. When the weather changed in April, we were quick to hang the screens. The windows all thrown open as a welcome. This morning, when I follow you inside, the house seems strange. Our absence like a burglary, a covering of sheets. Okay, so this next one, it takes place in the same little rented house that we had when we lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan. The landlady who we rented from, her father, he would raise these prize tomatoes there, and at one point the local paper came around and took a picture of him, and she helped us to get our tomatoes going one year, and then she sent us this letter in the mail with a clipping of the photograph that they had taken of her dad that day. So it got me thinking. And so this poem is for her. Her name is Ann Fulmer, and it's just simply called Tomatoes. An unexpected letter in the mail today. Our names inscribed in fountain pen, the franking mark and inky Rorschach smudge. Inside the envelope, old clippings from the local daily, a photograph enlarged on freckled paper, the sender's note of explanation folded sensibly and stapled to the rest. A little German lady owns the house. Last year, she saved our beef tomatoes, drove stakes into the soil, tied the leafy branches back with twine. Her father butchered rabbits raised in cages here, used their droppings as a fertilizer. In shirt sleeves, trousers clasped with braces, he's dwarfed by plants that tower 10 feet high. Old photographs are also public-minded. Behind our cellar door, the shadow of those vines, a wheel for sharpening, dim electric light, the years of quiet violence, what that was like. Okay, so moving forward, this next poem is like perhaps one of the very first poems that I wrote when I moved here to Fredericton. And it's just it sort of shows you what you can do with these sort of defamiliarizing gestures. I mean, it can all be very sort of like sinister and portentous, and that's sort of often where we take these. But it can also be sort of like a really like open up a kind of moment of imminence. And I feel like this poem sort of really tries to accomplish that, tries to see the sort of transformative power of this sort of strangeness, if you will. So it's simply called Sparrowfall. And it's for my son, Benjamin. Your mother at the market with your sister. I'm left bleary-eyed to rustle up our breakfast. Keep you occupied and minded while she haggles over poultry, skeins of sock wool, winter clementines. Like a pair of errant schoolboys playing truant, we eat scrambled eggs and gherkins, horse around in our pajamas, pull the shears aside to watch the year's first snowstorm. Fern frost clouds the corners of the window, makes the world outside seem formless, somehow incomplete. A voice half heard in fevered sleep, Brian Eno's fragile soundtrack for imaginary films, repeats itself behind us like a signal wave transmitted from beyond the frozen planets, a wave that washes everything. For the first time in a long time, I feel put at peace. The morning, like a waking dream, unfolds, oblique by strategy. Okay, so halfway through. This next one, these ones, I guess this last half of the reading sort of becomes a little bit more sort of interiorized in the sense. It becomes more focused on sort of like just the individual rather than like the family, just sort of like that selfhood in a sense, sort of reaching to try and make connections. This one is called So Far Away. And it sort of explores the strangeness that emerges in a familiar space that's kind of decontextualized. So in this case, it's like a busy retail space that's transformed in the absence of people. Like, are you guys getting let me see if I can just turn out of this. That's better. Again, it's sort of like the last poem in that it really tries to sort of like mine the scene to try and come up with sort of like an epiphanic sense of sort of quiet wonder. That was sort of like what I was attempting here. And the title is taken from the first track of Dire Straits' Brothers in Arms. And so if you guys remember that from 1985, it was a smash hit record. So it takes place right around that time. So far away. Each evening, with his tie uncinched, the manager would lock me in and make towards his town and country K car. The punch clock in the stock room was an acro print that sounded like an old pneumatic nail gun. A teenaged third shift menial in stone-washed jeans and high-top leather Reeboks. I'd sail around the shop floor on the fork rods of a pallet jack. The checkout lanes and grocery aisles as empty as a universal backlot. At sunup, all my jobs complete, undone and stoned on black hashish, I'd crank the Dire Straits CD the sales staff always used for demonstration, fly past bargain bins and end caps like a hobo on a handcar in a silent era comedy. The drag wind in my face and hair, the rumble of the wheels beneath my feet. Okay, so these next two sort of continue with the same kind of exploration. I would say they probably get a little darker. The one I'm about to read is called Advent. It's like a Christmas Day poem. So I think where you get that sense of disassociation or defamiliarization is that when we think about Christmas Day, of course, we think about like socializing with family, whereas in this case, it's basically sort of like a study of being isolated in that context. So I think that's where you get there. That's where I tried to create the tension at the very least. Okay, so Advent. The others all upstairs asleep at midday. I find myself implausibly alone. Our rib roast dressed and waiting in the kitchen. The hymn of Good King Wenceslas, just a whisper on the radio. In the stillness of the moment, I'm reminded of the poems of Robert Service, those old earnest benedictions of my father's, their tales of Arctic sourdoughs, of silences like winding sheets, the blank and unrelenting snow. My canning jar of winter ale, near finished on the table. Torn strips of tape, a braided wrap, discarded on the floor. Such solitude on Christmas Day consoles as it gives pause. A panto clown in whiteface, once the audience has gone, I study what's reflected in the mirror. Find the cold cream, smooth it on. So you guys know about the tradition, like the English tradition of the panto clown. It goes back like centuries, and at Christmas time they always put on these sort of ridiculous pantomimes for children, really. And the pantomime clowns always have like a white face. Okay, so this is the very last poem, and this is one that I've written recently, and it sort of grapples with the feelings, I guess, that we all share about being trapped in our dwellings because of the pandemic. And so here, the home space, which we so often see as a refuge sanctuary, is sort of reframed as title is taken from the second song on side A of the Eagles' 1979 LP, The Long Run. Okay. You guys hear me okay? Perfect. Okay, so it's called I Can't Tell You Why. Another dinner finished at the table, the kitchen still congested with the smells of fish and broccoli. I rise and cue the needle on the long run. Stop and listen for the crackle. Clear the dining room of silverware and crockery. The first few months of lockdown gave us time to get things straight, to bolster our provisions, plot our bearings, fix the world in place. Back then, we lived like pioneers in long johns, read for pleasure, kept our distance as the winter lost its way. These days, we're caught like revenants, unable to escape, like houseflies in an abattoir, annealed to strips of capture tape. Thank you.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to hear you read aloud, Philip. It's so, well, for me, it's quite familiar, and it's wonderful to have that experience again. I think, so Philip and I are going to engage in a little exchange, and then we'll open it up for questions. And Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm asking the first question. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about was the sense of the domestic in your poems. You already mentioned this in your introduction to one of them. So for the most part, the poems you read today embrace the domestic. They take place in homes, in rooms, around the table, with family. In the announced absence of family, they remember an old home. So I'm wondering about, domesticity is something that's usually such a familiar and familiarizing thing. And yet here you render it quite alien and alienating. And so I guess I wonder, why do you think that contrast is so central to your work? I remember it being also central to other work of yours that I've read.
Right, yeah, I think this has kind of been ongoing for me. I moved around a lot in my life. I was born in Northern Ireland. I lived in Africa for a couple of years when I was a kid. We moved to Canada. I lived in the States for 10 years. I've been here now. I'm in Atlantic Canada for 10 years. At one point I remember tracing it out, and I was in a different school for something like 8 or 9 years in a row. Right, so I guess home to me has always been something that's been sort of, I've been unable to grasp it as something real, because every time I felt like I was getting closer to it, it was the rug was sort of pulled out, and it's like, next, on to your next experience where maybe you will find some kind of sense of home place. So I think that's part of it. So when I explore all of these domestic spaces, I guess I'm sort of looking for that. I also feel like there's a kind of hidden aspect of the everyday lived experience that can be sort of uncovered if you sort of worry it enough, you know what I mean? If you just sort of like really work hard at sort of trying to sort of peel away the veneer to get at what's underneath. So I feel like the ordinary can almost be sort of coerced into revealing its secrets if you stay with it long enough. So I think that's sort of part of it as well. I think I'm also just sort of endlessly fascinated just by the empirical world, and I write as much about, as you could hear, about public spaces as I do about private ones. I'm endlessly fascinated by like grocery stores, that kind of thing, like going into like these kinds of environments So yeah, I would say that's ultimately the big part is that I think that personally I've never been able to find a true sense poem, so I'm always looking for one.
That's really, it's really interesting to hear. I wrote down the ordinary coerced into revealing its secrets. That so well sums up what I hear in those poems. That's really great.
Yeah, you really just have to stay with it. You have to be patient.
Mhm.
Okay, so I have some questions for you. I definitely have this first question. Let me see here. Right. So, our approaches are somewhat different, right? But we're still sort of trying to get at the same thing, ultimately. So, I say here, in my poems, the speaker tends to behave or extemporize in ways that are consistent with my own values and sensibilities as the author. Despite the fact that my work is often story-driven, I remain committed to the lyric tradition. And for that reason, I always pay particular attention to what Stuart Hall refers to as the point of enunciation in the text. So yours, Sarah, is complex and difficult to locate, which makes your verse all the more fascinating, I think. So instances of first person address are rare in your poems, and you never once use the lyric I, which is something I noticed. So can you talk a little bit about what you hope to achieve by creating this remove?
Yeah, this was such a great question. And it was one that it was very enriching for me to think about in terms of my own work. And what I sort of settled upon was that I think the speaker of my poems behaves in a way that reflects my desire to decenter and even humble the human experience. And so I know that sounds like an odd stance, and it's not meant to be dismissive of lyric eyes or human-centered poems. But when I look over my work, I see it as a unifying feature. And so I guess my hope is that the voice of my poems is less determined by a sense of the speaker's experience and point of speaking, and more by a way of seeing. So really, I want the persona to be the lens itself, and that point of speaking as a sense of detachment. So I guess a short answer to that question is that this is a remove I use to decenter and humble the human.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. It's funny because for a long time, I had a lot of difficulty using the lyric I myself, and I would always use the plural. So it would be, we did this, we did that, right? And even like Richard Tillinghast, who was my mentor at Michigan, he wrote the blurb for the back of my book, and he called me a rueful and reluctant lyricist, right? So it's like, yes, absolutely. It's like I was very self-conscious about entering the poem as an I, and always tried to couch it in terms of like a plurality that would sort of allow me to sort of like step aside a little bit. But I've become more comfortable, I guess, as time has gone on.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You have a great answer.
Yeah, I think there is a we in my poems, but it's not a lyric we.
Yes.
It's a specimen we, and we didn't hear it so much in the ones I read today. But it's functioning quite differently, I think, and it has that same sense of remove. One of the things that I've always loved about your work is the sheer precision of the imagery, both auditory images and visual images. They're so strong, they're so precise, they're so thematic. That I think any number of the phrases in these poems would make an outstanding title for a collection. I think I could, give you 5 collection titles right now if you want them. Well, you gave them to yourself. So examples that I loved: a wheel for sharpening, dumbfounded at the table, our absence like a burglary, and my favorite from that last poem, houseflies in an abattoir. And I think that one thing these images do is reintroduce us to objects and feelings in a way that's really quite startling. And I wonder, this is a bit of a process question. I'm also asking it with a bit of jealousy. How much do you labor over these images?
Yeah, well, quite a bit. I feel like more than anything else in my writing process, what it comes down to is refusing a lot of things, right? It's like, yeah, that might do, but it's not good enough, or it's not appropriate, or this could be better. So much of it is like, nope, or even something that's really great that just doesn't belong in that poem. Right? It's like maybe you could save it for something else, maybe not. But I think so much of it, like the way that I make images, comes down to sort of analogical equivalencies, right? So you're trying to find, what the answer is to this thing, like houseflies in an abattoir. Okay, so that's like you're using a simile to create that tension. So it's a matter of like, well, how far can I reach? How ambitious can I be in moving from one thing to another and still have that sort of line, like attaching the two, like this thin little thread of like association that allows them to sort of coexist together. So I feel like that's always a challenge for me. I'm always looking for something that, in theory hasn't been thought of before. I mean, I feel like everything has in some ways, sort of like our predicament living in a postmodern world. But you can't be defeated. You can't be defeated by that. You have to try and imagine that no one's thought of it before. But I will say one other thing is that when I'm writing, I have to say my first allegiance is always to sound and rhythm. So if it doesn't sound right, it's not happening. Right? And I spend more time on that than I do on absolutely anything else. It has to sound right.